Hey, hi again. You probably won't know this because you'll never see the first take, but this is actually take two of my fourth video journal, video diary, whatever you'd like to refer to it as, for international public relations. Take one, unfortunately, my laptop died and we lost it all. So that'll teach me for not plugging in or recharging my battery, but we'll try again. Hopefully, well, you'd think that my thoughts would be more precise and I would have everything worked out in my head, seeing as I've already done this once, but probably not, knowing me. To start today's little reflection, I thought I'd sort of talk about something that I've sort of noticed about my own sort of learning and thought processes. Basically, in class, generally when we're having discussions, I'll sort of think of things, okay, I'll talk about that in my personal reflection, or that's something, okay, I'm getting it this way, this is how I would describe it, or this is how I sort of understand something. I think, okay, well, I'll talk about that. And then I sit down a couple of days after class, because I can't record straight after class because I get home really late at night, and all of a sudden I don't really remember exactly what I thought I was going to talk about. So maybe I do take notes, and obviously I generally tend to write down sort of things that are being said, or sort of what comes up on the screen, but maybe I need to sort of write notes more on what I think, or what the way I interpret things, rather than sort of writing things down verbatim as what someone else said. That's just sort of something I've noticed about myself, that I get my sort of little notes. I generally look a bit like this, a few pages of these from each class, and I look back at them and I think, where are all the ideas that I thought I was going to talk about? So that's just something little for me, but I thought the class was really interesting. We've sort of really started to look at the circuit of culture as a theory, and sort of started discussing that, and I actually find it quite interesting. I do think it's sort of something, it's a lot harder to sort of wrap your head around than sort of other public relations theories, but I think that in the long run I can definitely see its value, especially working in international public relations. Not just that, but I guess within sort of working within Australian public relations, because obviously Australia has its own culture and it's important for us to understand that culture and maybe apply those principles even when you're just working locally, because it's not something that I would have thought about prior to sort of taking this class and looking at these theories. So we concentrated firstly on the moment of regulation, and then we sort of touched on also the moment of representation. And representation was one I remember when I was going through that was a little bit harder for me to understand, because I wasn't sure quite how it differed from the moment of production. Sort of when I was reading things I thought there was a little bit of crossover, but I might have to go back and have a look, reread a few things to sort of understand that. In terms of regulation, which is what we first talked about, the way I sort of view it is the moment of regulation is almost like the context in which you're working. So it's the social norms that exist, and the laws that you're working around, and the government, and I guess and the economic status of the people that you're talking to, things like that, that sort of make up the general context of the area in which you're working, I guess, or the culture in which you're working. There's sort of, in terms of sort of each of those things, technology is another one. I don't think any of those elements, are any more important than each other, because just because something is a law doesn't make it any more, doesn't necessarily give it more emphasis in a country than cultural, social norms that exist. Sometimes they are adhered to just as much, if not sometimes more so, than laws that exist. So I think it's definitely important to really understand, I guess, the moral of the story is to really understand the culture that you're working in, because without knowing that, or without doing that, without having that information, it's really going to make it hard for you to be that intermediary, to work and build those relationships if you don't know who you're building the relationships with, or don't understand what is important to them. We looked at the cultural constructs proposed by, I say Hofstede. I do not know how to pronounce the name properly. I'm pretty sure that's wrong, so maybe we can refer to him as Mr. H, but Mr. H's cultural constructs. And I found it really interesting, sort of, and I'm glad we sort of looked at the website, because I'm going to definitely go back and have a look at that. But the way in which different countries and their different cultures differ, it really does make sense to take into account those things when you're producing these materials for public relations campaigns, or when you're developing a strategy for the public relations campaign. So we look at the different ones: the individualistic versus collectivistic, the power distance, the uncertainty avoidance, high context versus low context cultures. That was one I hadn't actually heard of before, and I find that really interesting. And the idea of a shared meaning to me seems really nice. And it's funny that I guess you only sort of get that. Seems really nice to me, but unfortunately the culture, I guess, that we live in, or I live in personally, I don't really sort of see that. I'd see that would be more a low context culture. I don't know, that just from my understanding, from what I got of the definition, I guess that yes, we aren't living in a high context culture, but I do like the idea of that. One thing I did think was interesting was when we were looking on the internet and looking at the different values that are placed on the different cultural constructs for each country. I noticed that when we were looking at the African countries, that their uncertainty avoidance was actually high, and then some of the countries that I thought it would have been higher, like China, was actually low. So I don't understand, maybe I'm understanding or taking the meaning of uncertainty avoidance differently, but I would have thought, yeah, I don't know, that was just something that I found interesting, that I thought I would note. Other than that, I seem to be babbling a bit. Yes, representation. That was the other thing I was going to talk about. Like I said, we started to go into this. I don't know if we sort of completely finished it. We started talking about postmodernism and the difference between sort of the classic scientific way of thinking, and then the postmodernism, sort of the critical thinking. And I find that that's really interesting, and I sort of wonder why we aren't moving, or why more aspects of life, more aspects of business don't sort of employ that postmodernistic view. Because, like we discussed in class, it does say that you can't sort of be sort of super left-brained or super right-brained, I guess, in the way of looking at things. It's about sort of having something that's a little bit of both, and I think that makes perfect sense. So I'm not sure why in some ways we're so stuck on that sort of classic scientific, sort of traditional approaches, as opposed to these new sort of critical approaches to things. So that was definitely interesting to think about. See, representation, I've just gotten more notes again, but representation is the form an object takes and the meaning that's encoded in that form. I thought about it, and something that sort of stuck out for me when I was doing the readings was that objects, or public relations materials, or things in general, don't necessarily have an inherent meaning. It's society, it's culture. As we, as viewers of the object or users of the object, we give meaning. We give meaning, which means that one object can have 100 meanings if 100 people are viewing it, and that to me is kind of daunting, because it means that it's going to be really hard. How do you sort of produce a message, or produce a sort of a public public relations materials or strategies and have it mean what you want it to mean to the people who you are talking to. So I guess that's a major challenge for public relations professionals, especially working in international public relations. But I think that's sort of pretty much it in terms of what I wanted to talk about for this one. We did look at models of communication and how that's changed and how it's no longer a one-way linear process. In some ways it's almost like a spiral, that we encode meaning in something, someone receives that, they decode that meaning, take how they understand it, then create a new message, encode that meaning, send that back, and I guess it's like a back and forward, round and round process, I guess. And in terms of the spirals, that you never you're going round and round, but you never come back to the exact same spot. New meaning is constantly generated. So yeah, I might finish it there. Bye.